There is a verse in the Bible that most people read without realizing that there, at that exact point, is hidden the most radical and most dangerous truth about the power of the human mind. A truth so potent that if you really understood what was being said, if you allowed those words to penetrate not just your mind, but the deepest structure of your consciousness, your entire life would change direction like a river that suddenly finds a new crevice in the rock and flows into completely unknown territory. But the problem is that no one taught you to read the Bible that way. No one showed you that. There is a brutal difference between looking at the words and actually seeing them, between reciting memorized verses and allowing the truth contained in them to destroy all the comfortable illusions you have built about who you are and what is possible for a human being. And Simone Weil, the French philosopher who dedicated her very short life of just 34 years to this radical practice of attention, discovered something in this verse that most theologians, preachers, biblical scholars spend their entire lives without seeing, because they are reading with her mind, and Weil learned to read with something much deeper. She learned to read with her soul completely open and vulnerable, without protections, without prefabricated interpretations, without the desperate need for the text to confirm what she already believes, and what she found there terrified her and freed her. At the same time, have you noticed how we spend our entire lives being taught to use the mind in completely the wrong way? How we are told to think positive, to visualize our goals, to affirm what we want as if the mind were a tool of manifestation, as if the power of thought was about getting what we want, about shaping reality according to our wills, about making the universe obey the ego's commands. But what if the true power of the mind, the one the Bible describes in this particular verse, was just the opposite? What if real power was not about gaining control, but about letting go of control completely? Not about strengthening the ego, but about dissolving it. Not about making reality bend to your will, but about allowing your will to dissolve into reality until it is no more difference between what you want and what is. And Simone Weil saw this in the biblical text with such brutal clarity that it completely changed not just how she thought, but how she existed in the world. Because she understood that when the Bible talks about the power of the mind, it is not talking about positive thinking or creative visualization. It is talking about something infinitely more radical and infinitely more dangerous to the ego that you spend your entire life protecting. It is talking about attention, about the human ability to look at something without projecting onto it. Your needs, your fears, your desires, your interpretations. It's talking about the terrifying and liberating possibility of seeing things exactly as they are without the constant filter of the self that needs everything to be a certain way. And that's not self-help. That's not law of attraction. That's something much deeper and much more demanding because it requires you to die in ways that most people can't even imagine. Not physical death, but ego death. Death of the stories you tell about yourself. Death of the constant need for life to confirm who you think you are. And if you feel that these words are touching something inside you that has been dormant, something that you knew existed but never knew how to name, something that is starting to wake up and ask questions that you are afraid to answer. So subscribe to this channel now, because we are going to explore together this specific verse that Simone Weil discovered. We are going to get down to the depths of what it really means about the power of the human mind, and you won't want to miss what comes next, because when you finally understand what is being said there, when you allow these words to do what they came for do, there is no turning back. You can no longer pretend you don't know. You can no longer live on the comfortable surface of shallow interpretations. You will have to choose between continuing to sleep or waking up completely. And Simone Weil chose to wake up, paid the price that demands, and what she discovered on the other side of that choice will change everything. You think about power, about mind, about what is possible when a human being finally stops using consciousness as a tool of control and allows it to become what it was always meant to be. But before we get to the verse, specifically, before we dive into the heart of this brutal truth that Simone Weil extracted from the scriptures, you need to understand why this kind of reading is so rare, why most people can read the Bible 100 times, 1,000 times, and never see what Weil saw, why there is a fundamental difference between reading with the mind that seeks to confirm what it already knows and reading with the mind that is willing to be destroyed by what it finds. And this difference is not small. It is not a question of technique or education. It is a question of courage, of willingness to lose everything you have built, all the certainties that keep you safe, all the interpretations that protect your ego from having to face truths it cannot bear. Simone Weil grew up in a secular Jewish family in France at the beginning of the 20th century, a child prodigy who at the age of 3 already read, who at 5 could memorize entire poems, who grew up in the shadow of a brother, Simone Weil, who would become one of the most brilliant mathematicians of his generation. And at 14, Simone went through a crisis so profound that it almost destroyed her. She was convinced that she was stupid, that she would never be capable of true abstract thought, that she was doomed to live on the surface of things. While truly brilliant minds like her brothers penetrated the deep truths of mathematics and philosophy. And this pain, this feeling of intellectual inadequacy, could have destroyed her completely. But instead, it led her to make a discovery that would change her entire life. She realized that there was another kind of intelligence, another kind of understanding that had nothing to do with speed of reasoning or mathematical brilliance. It was intelligence of attention, the ability to look at something with infinite patience, without rushing to conclusions, without the need to dominate or control what is being observed, simply to look with all the soul, with all the presence, with all the vulnerability. And it was this capacity for attention that eventually led to Weil. To the scriptures, not as a traditional believer, not as someone seeking religious comfort or easy answers, but as someone seeking truth, with the urgency of someone who knows they are running out of time, because Weil had suffered from severe headaches since she was a teenager. Pain so intense that she described it as being crushed by a hammer constantly beating inside her skull. Pains that accompanied her every day of her adult life, and eventually contributed to her death at the age of 34. So when Simone Weil sat down to read the Bible, she wasn't playing spirituality. She wasn't seeking experience. A pleasant religious woman was searching for something that could sustain her in the midst of suffering that threatened to completely destroy her ability to exist. And it was with this desperate but pure attention, with this willingness to see what was actually written rather than what she wished was written, that she found the verse we are about to explore. But before she reveals what that verse is, you need to understand what Weil discovered about the very nature of spiritual reading. Because most of us have been taught to read sacred texts completely wrong. We have been taught to look to them for confirmation of what we already believe, comfort for our fears, justification for our actions, answers to questions that we already know how to ask. But Weil developed a completely different method that she called reading through attention. You sit with the text, read slowly, word by word, without rushing to understand, without the need to arrive at an interpretation. And when a sentence touches you, when something resonates in a way that you cannot explain rationally, you stop. You stay with that sentence. You repeat it mentally, not like a mechanical mantra, but like someone who is holding something delicate in their hands, trying to feel its meaning. True weight, its real texture, and you wait. Wait without specific expectation of what will happen. Wait with patience that most modern people have completely lost. Wait until the text begins to reveal layers that were not visible on the first reading, on the second, on the 10th. Wait until suddenly, without warning, without adequate preparation, the truth contained in those words explodes inside you like a bomb that was waiting for the right moment to detonate. And when that happens, you can no longer pretend that you didn't see it. You can no longer go back to the superficial reading. No, you can no longer treat the text as a dead object that you study from the outside. Because now you understand that sacred text is not to be studied. It is to be lived. It is not to be understood intellectually. It is to be experienced with all the vulnerability of the open soul. And that is exactly what happened to Simone Weil when she found this specific verse about the power of the mind. But what is the verse, you are wondering? What is this exact point in the Bible where the true power of the human mind is revealed? And here it is. It is in Philippians chapter 2, verses 5 through 8, where Paul writes about Christ, and the words are these, translated from the original Greek with the precision that Weil insisted was necessary. Have this mind in yourselves that was also in Christ Jesus, who, being in the form of God, did not consider equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself, taking the form of a servant, being made in the likeness of men, and being recognized in human form, he humbled himself and became obedient to the point of death. And most people read this and think it's about humility, about Jesus being a good example of modesty, about not being proud. But Simone Weil saw something completely different in these words. She saw the exact description of the supreme power of the human mind. She saw the precise map of how consciousness can completely transcend the limitations of the ego and enter into a state of existence that most people cannot even conceive of. And the key word, the word that Weil spent years meditating, studying, living, is the Greek word kenosis, which is translated as emptying oneself. But kenosis does not simply mean being humble or modest. Kenosis literally means emptying oneself completely, annihilate the self, dissolve the boundaries between self and non-self, allow individual consciousness to dissolve into universal consciousness. And this is not a nice metaphor. It is not poetic language to describe being a nicer person. It is an accurate description of a specific psychological and spiritual process that any human being can undertake if they have enough courage, if they are willing to pay the price it demands, and the price is everything. The price is every comfortable illusion you have about who you are, every need your ego has to be special, to be loved, to be recognized, to matter, every attachment you have to your own perspective, your own opinions, your own interpretations of reality, all of that has to go, all of that has to be emptied. And Simone Weil understood that when Paul says, "Have this mind in you which was also in Christ Jesus," he is not asking you to be morally good like Jesus. He is offering precise instruction on how to use the supreme power of the human mind. He is saying that you have the ability to do what Christ did, to go through the process of kenosis, of emptying yourself completely. And when you do that, when you actually allow the self to dissolve, something impossible happens. You do not cease to exist. You begin to exist more fully than you ever existed before, because now you are no longer trapped in the limitations of the individual ego. You are no longer trying to protect the fragile self that is afraid of everything. You are no longer living in a constant state of defense against reality. You are simply present, completely present, totally empty, and therefore totally full. And that is the real power of the mind that the Bible describes, not the power to manifest what you want, but the power to dissolve what you think you are, not the power to control reality, but the power to completely stop needing to control it, not the power to strengthen the ego, but the power to totally transcend it. And now you might be thinking that this all sounds beautiful but completely impractical. It sounds like abstract philosophy that has nothing to do with your real life, with your real problems, with the pain that you carry every day. But wait, because what does Simone? What Weil discovered was exactly the opposite. She discovered that kenosis, this radical emptying of the self, is not a practice for mystics in monasteries. It is not a spiritual exercise for people who have no real problems. It is exactly what is needed when you are in the midst of the most brutal suffering a human being can experience. It is the only thing that works when everything else has failed, when you have tried every self-help technique, when you have sought every advice, when you have fought with all your might and realized that the struggle itself is the problem. And Simone Weil didn't learn this by reading books. She learned it by living. She worked in Renault factories in 1934, brutal manual labor that destroyed the body and crushed the spirit. She experienced firsthand what she called affliction, which is not simply suffering, but something much worse. It is a combination of extreme physical pain, complete social degradation, and psychological anguish that makes you feel that you have stopped being human, that you have become a thing, an object, nothing. And in the midst of this affliction, at the absolute bottom of this abyss, Weil did not. She found comfort in positive thinking. She found no relief in motivational affirmations. She found no salvation in mind control techniques. She found something much more radical. She found that when she allowed the self to dissolve completely, when she stopped fighting the suffering and simply consented to it with pure attention, something changed. The pain did not disappear, but her relationship to the pain was completely transformed. She was no longer someone being tortured by the pain. She was consciousness observing pain happening. And that subtle difference is everything. It is the difference between being crushed by the suffering and bearing suffering with dignity. Is the difference between affliction that destroys and suffering that transforms. And this takes us back to the verse from Philippians, because Paul is not just describing what Christ did, he is saying, have the same mind in yourselves. He is saying, you can do this. You have this power. The power of the human mind is not the power to avoid suffering, but the power to go through it without being destroyed. The power to dissolve the self that is suffering and discover deeper awareness that can witness suffering without identifying completely with it. And before we go deeper into this, before we explore how this actually works in practice, I need to pause and know where you are watching this video from right now. What part of the world you are from, what city, what country, because there is something profoundly important about creating this community of people who are not looking for easy answers, who are not satisfied with superficial spirituality, who want truth even when it hurts. So leave in the comments your location. Tell me where you watch us from, because Simone Weil, wherever as she is now, she would be moved to know that all around the planet there are souls seeking the same kind of radical truth that she sought. So share your location in the comments. And now let's dive deeper into what Paul is really describing in this verse, because when he talks about Christ not considering equality with God a thing to hold on to, he is describing exactly the central problem of human existence. We all have a version of being equal to God that we desperately hold on to. For some it is intelligence, for others it is beauty, for others it is power, achievement, recognition, love from other people. But whatever it is, we cling to it as if our life depended on it, as if without that specific thing we would cease to exist. And this clinging, this desperate clinging, is exactly what Paul identifies as the problem, not because the thing itself is bad, but because the act of clinging creates the illusory self that then spends its entire life in a state of terror of losing what it is clinging to. And Christ, according to Paul, had every reason to cling. He was literally just like God. But he didn't consider it something to hold on to. He simply let go. He emptied himself completely. He became nothing. He became a servant. He became human in all his fragility and finiteness. And that wasn't humiliation in the sense of being forced into an inferior position. It was a radical choice. It was a supreme act of freedom. It was a demonstration of the real power of the human mind, the power to let go of absolutely everything and discover that you not only survive, but become freer than you ever thought possible. And Simone Weil saw this as not as a story about Jesus, but as a map for her own life. She saw kenosis as a daily practice, something you do moment by moment, not once, but constantly, because the ego is always trying to rebuild itself, always trying to hold on to something new, always creating new version of yourself that needs to be protected and defended. So kenosis is not a single event. It is a continuous practice of emptying, of letting go, of allowing the self to dissolve over and over again. And each time you do this, each time you let go of some attachment, some need, some story about who you are, you create space, you open emptiness, and that emptiness, that absence, is exactly what Paul and Weil identify as a necessary condition for grace, because you cannot receive something that your hands are already completely filled with holding. You cannot be filled by the divine if you are already completely filled by your own ego. You cannot experience real freedom if you are desperately clinging to some specific version of yourself. So the first movement, the fundamental movement, is to empty, is to let go, is to die to the self that you have so carefully constructed around over the years. And it's terrifying. It goes against every survival instinct you have, because it seems like if you let go of these things that you're holding on to, you will simply cease to exist. You will dissolve into nothingness. You will be annihilated. And Weil doesn't deny this fear. She recognizes that it is legitimate fear, because in a sense, you really do cease to exist. The you that you thought you were really dies. But what she discovered, what Paulo is trying to communicate, is that on the other side of this death, there is something that you cannot imagine while you are clinging. To the illusory self, there is a mode of existence that does not depend on ego, that does not need constant protection, that does not live in terror of loss, that simply is present, attentive, free. And this is what Paul means when he talks about Christ being exalted and receiving a name above every name after emptying himself completely. It is not a reward for good behavior, is a natural description of what happens when you stop trying to be something specific and simply allow reality to flow. Through you, without resistance, you do not become less, you become more, infinitely more, because now you are no longer limited by the narrow boundaries of the individual ego. You have become transparent to existence itself. And Simone Weil experienced this directly during her mystical experiences at Solesmes in 1938. She was attending Holy Week services. She was in the middle of one of her seizures. Severe headache, pain so intense that it would normally incapacitate her completely. But instead of fighting the pain or trying to escape it, she simply observed it with pure attention. She allowed the pain to exist without resistance, without judgment, without needing it to be otherwise. And in the midst of this absolute attention to the pain, something impossible happened, Christ, she wrote later. It came down and took possession of her. It was not a vision. It was not a hallucination. It was not an experience that she could adequately describe in words. It was simply presence, a presence that completely filled the void that she had created it through pure attention to suffering. And you can believe it literally, or you can see it as deep psychological experience. But what you can't deny is that something real happened, something that changed Weil completely, something that validated everything Paul was trying to communicate in that verse about kenosis, because she directly experienced that when you empty the self completely, when you stop clinging to any version of who you are, when you simply consent to reality without resistance, something comes in, something that was always there but couldn't penetrate while you were full of yourself. Same. Full of your needs, your interpretations, your defenses, your stories. And now we come to the heart of the real power of the mind that the Bible describes, power that has nothing to do with law of attraction or positive thinking or manifestation, power that is exactly the opposite of everything that self-help culture teaches, because self-help culture says, use your mind to get what you want, strengthen your ego, affirm your desires, visualize your goals. But the Bible, when read with the attention that Simone Weil practiced, says something radically different. It says, use your mind to dissolve your mind, empty your ego, let go of your desires, stop visualizing specific futures, and simply consent to what is. And that is much more difficult, much more demanding instruction, because it requires you to give up every illusion of control, every fantasy that you can manipulate reality to serve your needs, every comfortable belief that you are at the center of the universe and the universe must respond to your commands. Kenosis says you are not at the center. You are not as important as what you think you are. Your ego is not ultimate reality. It's just a fragile construct you created to feel safe in a universe that doesn't care about your fears or desires. And when you finally accept that, when you stop fighting this brutal truth, when you allow the ego to dissolve into the insignificance it always had but refused to admit, paradoxically, you become free in ways you never were when you were trying to be important, to be special, to be someone, because now you no longer need to protect your fragile self. You no longer need to prove your worth. No, you no longer need to make your life mean something specific. You simply exist. You simply observe. You simply allow life to happen through you rather than for you. And that is real power. The power of not needing power. The power of not needing to control. The power of simply being without needing to be something specific. And Simone Weil lived this in ways that most people would find impossible. She refused to eat more than the rations that the French under Nazi occupation received. Even when she was dying of tuberculosis in London, she could have eaten more, had access to food, but she chose to share the suffering of her people, chose to empty herself of even the basic need for survival. And you might say that this was too extreme, that it was self-destruction, not self-transcendence, and perhaps you are right. Perhaps Weil took kenosis too far. Perhaps she confused spiritual emptying with physical annihilation. But still, even if you believe she went too far, you cannot deny the purity of her intention, the radicality of her commitment to the truth that she saw in that verse from Philippians. She really tried to have the same feeling in herself that was in Christ Jesus. She really tried to empty herself completely, and in the process, she showed us something about the extreme limits of the power of the human mind, about how far we can go in our quest to transcend the ego, to dissolving the self, by existing in a state of pure awareness without needing to be someone specific. And even if you never go as far as Weil did, even if you choose a less extreme path, you can still learn from her. You can understand the fundamental principle that she was demonstrating, that the real power of the mind is not in asserting what you want, but in dissolving who you think you are, is not in visualizing specific futures, but in fully consenting to the present, is not in strengthening the ego, but in transcending it. And that brings us back to practical question. How do you actually do this? How do you practice kenosis in the midst of normal life, in the midst of work, relationships, responsibilities, common everyday pains? How do you empty the self without literally starving like Weil did? And the answer lies in the practice that Weil valued most, the practice of attention. Because attention, true attention, pure attention, is kenosis in action. Every time you pay real attention to something, every time you look at something without the need for it to be different, without projecting your feelings onto it, interpretations, your desires, your fears, you are practicing emptying. You are temporarily dissolving the ego. You are existing in a mode that is not about you, that does not need you, that simply allows reality to be what it is. And this may seem simple, but it is probably the hardest thing a human being can do, because our mind is constantly interpreting, judging, reacting, planning, worrying, remembering. Our mind never just observes, it always adds something. It always colors the experience with its own needs and fears. So pure attention, attention that simply sees without adding anything. It is revolution. It is kenosis happening moment by moment. It is the practice of emptying the self each time you choose to simply observe instead of reacting, simply seeing instead of interpreting, simply being present instead of being lost in your own thoughts. And if you start practicing this, if you start noticing how many times a day your mind is adding something to direct experience, how many times you are not really seeing what is in front of you because you are too busy interpreting, judging, reacting, you will realize that you live almost completely within your own ego, almost never experiencing reality directly, almost always experiencing your filtered version of reality. And every time you realize this and choose to simply see, simply observe, simply be present, without adding interpretation, you are practicing the power of the mind that Paul describes in Philippians. You are having the same feeling in yourself that was in Christ Jesus. You are emptying yourself, even if just for a moment, even if the ego quickly rebuilds itself and you have to do it all over again, because it is process, not event. It is a daily, moment-to-moment practice of choosing attention over reaction, presence over interpretation, being over doing, and gradually, very gradually, you begin to realize that there is something in you that is not ego, something that can observe the ego without completely identifying with it, something that can exist in a state of pure attention without needing to be anyone specific. And that something, that awareness that observes, is what Weil called the supernatural part of the soul. It is what the Christian tradition calls the image of God in us. It is what Paul is pointing out when he says that we can have the same feeling in ourselves that was in Christ. Because Christ, in this reading, is not just a unique historical figure. He is a representation of what every human being can become when they finally choose to empty their ego and exist in a state of pure attention to reality. And you don't need to be a Christian to understand this. You don't need to believe in the divinity of Christ to see the psychological and spiritual truth of what Paul is describing. You just need to be willing to experiment, to try, to practice pure attention for a few moments a day and see what happens. And what Simone Weil discovered, what she tested in her own life to the point of death, is that it works. It really transforms your relationship with suffering, with reality, with your own existence. It doesn't solve all problems. It doesn't eliminate pain. It doesn't make life easy. But it changes something fundamental in the way you carry it all. It changes you from someone who is constantly fighting reality to someone who can simply observe it, be present with it, consent to it, without the need for it to be different. And that subtle change is everything, is the difference between life lived in constant resistance and life lived in radical acceptance, between ego-defined existence that needs everything to be a certain way and existence that can simply flow with what is. And if you've come this far with me, if you've allowed these words to penetrate not just your mind, but something deeper, if you feel like something inside you is starting to wake up to possibilities that you didn't even know existed, then leave a like on this video, because it shows me that these words are reaching those who really need them, those who are ready to hear more radical truth about mind power, and subscribe to the channel so we can continue this journey of exploring the truths that most are afraid to look at. Because there are many other teachings hidden in the scriptures, many other truths that Simone Weil has extracted with her fierce attention and pure, and together we can continue to discover what it really means to use the mind not as a tool of control, but as an instrument of liberation, not to strengthen the ego, but to transcend it completely. And now, having explored what Paul is really saying in this verse from Philippians, having seen how Simone Weil lived this truth to its ultimate consequences, it remains only to recognize that this knowledge, this understanding of the real power of the mind, is not something you acquire once and that's it. It is not information that you add to your repertoire of useful concepts. It is an invitation to radical transformation that will to continue for the rest of your life, is a choice you have to make moment by moment, every day. The choice between living from ego or living from attention, between desperately clinging to who you think you are or emptying yourself and discovering who you really are when all illusions fall away. And Simone Weil has shown us that this choice is possible, that human beings really can live this way, not perfectly, not without struggle, not without moments of failure and doubt, but genuinely, authentically, in a way that completely changes the quality of existence. And perhaps the greatest gift she left us is not an answer to how to live, but a living example of someone who really tried, who really devoted herself to the truth she saw in that verse about kenosis, who really emptied herself until there was almost nothing left of the ego that we all so carefully protect. And in the process, she gave us permission to do the same. She showed us that it is possible, that it is not just abstract philosophy, but a real way of existing in the world. A way that requires everything of you but offers something in return that cannot be adequately described, just experienced, only lived, only known, directly through the practice of attention that dissolves the self and reveals what was always there underneath. Pure consciousness, simple presence, impersonal love that needs no object, that simply is. And when Paul says have the same feeling in you that was also in Christ Jesus, he is offering this possibility to every human being. He is saying that you have this power, power to empty yourself, power to dissolve the ego, power to exist in a state of pure attention that needs nothing, wants nothing, it simply is. And Simone Weil showed us that he was right, that this is not just a beautiful idea, but an accessible reality, a true path, a practice that works if you have the courage to really try, to really empty yourself, to really die to the self you have so carefully constructed and discover what lies on the other side of that voluntary death. Then the invitation is here. The verse is open in front of you. Paul's words echoing across 2,000 years, still carrying the same radical truth about the power of the human mind. Power that is not about getting what you want, but about dissolving who you think you are. A power that does not strengthen the ego but completely transcends it. A power that Simone Weil dedicated her entire life to understanding and living, and now the choice is yours. You can continue living from the ego, clinging desperately to who you think you are, using your mind to try to control reality and make it serve your needs. Or you can begin to practice kenosis, emptying pure attention. You can have the same feeling in you that was in Christ Jesus. You can experience directly what happens when you finally lets it all go and allows reality to simply be what it is without her constant interference. And Simone Weil doesn't promise it will be easy. She lived up to 100 pounds at the end of her life, body literally consumed by her practice of emptying. But she also experienced moments of grace, of presence, of union with the divine that most people never know because they are too busy protecting the ego to allow it to dissolve. So maybe you don't have to go as far as she did. Maybe you can find middle ground between total emptying and preserving the ego. But the invitation remains. The verse is still there. Paul's words still carry the same power, and the mindfulness practice that Weil developed still works for anyone willing to really try. So keep looking, keep paying attention, keep practicing that emptiness. Mind from moment to moment, and see what happens. See where this practice takes you. See what you discover about the real power of the mind when you finally stop using it to control and start using it to liberate. And remember, you are not alone on this journey. Simone Weil walked this path before you, left marks that you can follow, and there are others around the world, right now, in this moment, practicing the same attention, experiencing the same emptying, discovering the same power of mind that the Bible describes in that verse from Philippians. Then take a deep breath, Let go of what you are holding on to, observe without judging, be present without needing to be someone specific, and allow the real power of the mind, power of kenosis, power of pure attention, power of impersonal love, to manifest through you, not because you are seeking to manifest something, but because you have finally stopped seeking and simply allowed grace to enter the space created by your emptying.